Hello and welcome back to Lamentations chapter 2. We're in a series called Lamentations of a Fallen Kingdom. Again, this is Lamentations chapter 2. We're going to go through Lamentations 1 through 5, chapter by chapter, looking at and looking for discipleship principles that help mold us into more and more the image of Christ. So we see very clearly in verses 1 and 2 of chapter 2, God's wrath and our sin. And this is kind of one of the main themes throughout the first two chapters, but we have here the theme of the book kind of comes out in chapter 2, 1 and 2. It is because of our sinfulness, the Lord's anger burns and is unstoppable by human efforts. That's kind of like the big idea, the main idea here. So let's put it one way, or how about this, put it another way. The Lord don't play, if you want to be grammatically correct, the Lord doesn't play around with sin. He takes it very seriously. Chapters 1 and 2 together are quite scary. I mean, it's a snapshot of the anger of God and His wrath poured out on Israel. And it should scare us to some degree. I think if you read these two, it should invoke some sense of fear. Because we don't serve a fluffy puppy, right? Sometimes we get this image of God like He's this fluffy little puppy, and we can pet him, and He doesn't bite, He doesn't bark. No, we don't serve a fluffy putty. We don't serve a fluffy puppy. We serve a mighty God, a roaring lion, an all-powerful, all-consuming, mighty God. That is who we worship. That is who we serve, and He is worthy of all of our awe and all of our wonder, respect, and obedience. And so while so much is said about God's love throughout the entire Bible, and it's there, chapters 1 and 2 of Lamentations focus on His mighty wrath. And one might add, really just His wrath, but that would actually be incorrect. As we're going to see even later in chapter 2, God's love peeks through even through His wrath. But by the end of chapter 2, after reading these two chapters together, we should come to the place where we are desperate for the love of God. And I might posit that was Jeremiah's aim, was to get us to a place where we are longing for God's love like it is water in a desert. And that desert is our sinfulness and His judgment for it. And when we get to chapter 3, we get a breath of fresh air. And I can't wait to get there. But first, we need to go through the desert to get to the oasis. So wait till chapter 3, but we're almost there. Don't rush through the harsh stuff. The resolution in chapter 3 is so sweet and so beautiful only because it is put up against the dark dissonance of chapter 1 and 2. And as we dive in and dig in, I want to remind us that we don't serve a fluffy puppy, but we serve a mighty roaring lion. And here we see the lion's roar against our sin. God's wrath leaves us desperate for His love. Now we're going to look at a snapshot of God's wrath. This kind of takes place in 3 through 12, and we're going to look through these examples. I think Jeremiah does a good job of taking a snapshot of what they're going through. God alienates Himself from sinners, and we see right there in verse 3, God has cut down in fierce anger all the might of Israel, all their might. Nothing before the fierce anger of God. And he says He has withdrawn from them His right hand in the face of the enemy. So many times throughout the Old Testament, God's hand went with Israel and propelled them to victory. He has now removed that hand. He has alienated Himself from their sin and from the sinners. And I think that is true in our lives as well as Christians. We live, if we get caught up in a habitual sin, God will remove His presence from our lives. And that should scare us. That should leave us longing to come back to the presence of God. He does that for a reason, to get us to long to come back to Him. See, Israel now has, for so long, gone and worshipped other gods, and God is saying, fine, if you want them, you can have them. I'll remove my hand from you. I'm no longer protecting you. And the weight was too much to bear. God seems like an enemy. So this really takes place in verse 4 on. He has a bow, so he has bent his bow like an enemy. He has killed all who were delightful in our eyes. He is laid waste and laid in ruins, very active in his judgment here. And we just watch this. He has swallowed up all of Israel's palaces. He has laid ruins, their strongholds. He has multiplied mourning and lamentation. He has laid waste to the booth like a garden. He has laid ruins, his meeting place. That is the temple. The Lord has made Zion forget festival and Sabbath. He's actually got them to the place where he has even caused them to forget to celebrate or not even be able to celebrate. The result of God's judgment in verses 12 through the end of the chapter are staggering, are heart-wrenching. I mean, you obviously see some of them here as we kind of look at a snapshot of God's wrath, right? This laying to ruin, laying to waste, forgetting festival, not being able to celebrate festival, spurned kings and priests, scorned altars and disowned sanctuaries in verse 7. And it leads us to kind of verse 12 where we see here is the full result of God's judgment. Well, we see futility as one of the results of God's judgment. When God judges our lives and the lives of the Christian, the disciple, it brings about futility. How does that happen in this verse? Well, let's look. You have sunken gates. These gates that are supposed to be entrances and supposed to be strongholds to keep the enemy out have sunken into the ground. And let's see, you find that in verse 9. Her gates have sunk into the ground. He has ruined and broken her bars of the gates that would keep people out are broken. Kings have been scattered. Her kings and princes are among the nations. They're not supposed to be among the nations. They're supposed to be in Israel. What kind of futility are kings who are scattered in foreign lands? The law is no more. The futility of the law. The law of the land is supposed to help the people live rightly and keep order, and it's just gone. There's no more. Futility, utter futility. Her prophets, these people who are supposed to get visions from God, have no visions. I mean, watch this in verse 9 again. And her prophets find no vision from the Lord. And this is utter futility of the prophets, the kings, and the strongholds to keep people out. When God's judgment comes upon us for our sin, it brings about our futility, the futility of sin, you could say. Suddenly we are no match for anything because God's wrath is complete, it is full. We cannot overcome it by human efforts at all. It brings about mourning, not the mourning, but sadness and sorrow. And we see this really throughout the whole first two chapters and throughout the whole book. I mean, the book is titled mourning or sorrow. That's what lamentation even means. I mean, that's a harsh title for a book, and he captures that very beautifully and very well. So where do we see that? Verse 11, he says, "My eyes are spent with weeping." Just can you get that picture? His eyes, they're done. There's no more tears. He has cried out all the tears he could possibly cry, and it's not enough. And again, my stomach churns. This is deep. This is gut-wrenching sorrow. I mean, watch this. My bile is poured out to the ground because of the destruction of the daughter of my people. God's judgment has brought about intense mourning. And it brings about a posture of humility. And just kind of see the posture of humility here, where he looks at it and he talks about the women sit on the ground. He talks about they cry to their mothers, the children, "Where is the bread?" And they're faint like a wounded man in the streets of the city, and their life is poured out. Humility. They have nothing left to give. There's great weeping. I mean, you can see it. They cry. This is throughout. They cry, they weep, they cry out. There's this absolute, vision and picture of weeping. And that's what it brings about. It brings about helplessness. Again, we've seen that already with gates being sunken into the ground. They don't do much good there. Strongholds destroyed don't do a lot of good. So here we are again with helplessness. We see hungry children. I mean, I want you to get the utter helplessness that they find themselves in. Children are hungry. Mothers unable to feed their children. This is actually a picture, historically speaking, of the siege of Jerusalem, where there were reports that some mothers were so hungry they actually ate their own children, which is horrific. I mean, that is how intense that siege was, how intense the suffering of Jerusalem was during the siege where they were destroyed. And Jeremiah is almost looking back to that and saying, remember that sin brings about utter helplessness. Now it looks different perhaps for us, but it brings about a sense of helplessness where we find ourselves in a place we can't do anything to overcome the result of our sin, overcome the judgment of God in our lives because of our sin. I mean, I hope you're feeling the weight, because it should be heavy on your shoulders. And it brings us to this point. We need Christ. I mean, at this point in the chapter, and I hope you're feeling this angst of going, this is dark. There's no hope. You've said nothing hopeful. And you're right, because Jeremiah hasn't. But I think for us, sitting on this side of the New Testament, and this side of Christ coming down to earth, I think we have a wonderful perspective as we look at the helplessness, and we look at the humble posture, and we look at just the utter destruction sin causes and sin caused Israel. It brings us to a point we need Christ. And if you're watching this in 2020 or on into the future, the beautiful thing is we have Christ. He came down from heaven to earth. He lived among us. He lived the perfect life we couldn't live. He died on a bloody cross, and he rose again on the third day, and he paid the price for our sin so that we don't have to be helpless. We don't have to be hopeless. We don't have to be futile. All of our hope, our only hope, is Christ. And I hope you're feeling that. Where's the answer? The answer is Christ. And it's this book, if nothing else, in the 21st century, gets us to look for Christ. It creates searching. And I love the question he asks here, where he says, who can heal you? After looking at all these things, and he goes, I look at all this destruction and lack of joy and hunger and death and all the results of the sin. They're too much to bear. And then he goes, who can heal us? Who can heal you? Well, I think he's doing a very good job he's calling in the right direction. He's to the point where he senses the complete helplessness of the situation he's in, and it produces a search for something more, and that search leads him to go, who can heal you? With a rhetorical answer being, God can. Because I don't think Jeremiah is past the point. We're going to see in chapter 3, he's not past the point of going, I'm searching and I got no answers. He has answers. And the beauty is he knows his answer is in Christ, and we're going to see that in the next chapter. I can't wait to get there. But to answer his question, this sense of searching, who can help you? God can help you. God is there. And I think sometimes you have to get to the point where you got nowhere else to look but up. Watch how he does this in verse 13. He says, what can I say for you, and to what can I compare you, O daughter of Jerusalem? What can I liken to you that I might comfort you? He's trying to find comfort in all the things we talked about. And he says, O virgin daughter of Zion, for your ruin is vast as the sea. I mean, you don't get worse than that. I mean, the sea is very vast. And he's basically going, there's nowhere to compare this to. There's nowhere to comfort you. And he begs the question, who can heal you? And then we kind of see some of the, verse 14, some of the results of that futility. The prophets have seen for you false visions, deceptive visions. They have not exposed your sin as they were supposed to do. Futility of leadership, by the way. The leaders weren't doing as they were supposed to. Who can heal you? The leaders couldn't. Verse 14 says the leaders couldn't heal you. They led you astray. All the people who pass by, they can't heal you. Verse 15, they're just wagging their heads at you and hissing at you. They're mocking you. All your enemies are just railing against you. They're not going to help you. They're not going to heal you. Then in 17, he goes, the Lord has done what he has purposed. The Lord can heal you because the Lord is the one that's behind all that's happening to them. The answer to his question is the Lord can heal you. Let's look at some discipleship principles to kind of wrap this up. We want to look at discipleship principles. How can we apply this to our lives today to make us more into the image of Christ? Well, God will grab his people's attention. He did so in Lamentations through intense suffering. It may not be that for us, or it might. God chooses to judge and to call his attention, our attention to him in different ways. But God will grab his people's attention. So if God is grabbing your attention, listen, respond. How do we respond? Well, we must cry out to God. And I think you kind of see this where he says, look, O Lord, and see. He's crying out to God. See, he said, again, back, who can heal us? And then he goes, look, O Lord, and see. He knows God can heal. And he's crying out to God because he's got nowhere else to turn. We must cry out to God in the midst of our sorrow, in the midst of our suffering, whether that is of our own making or not. Whether it's the result of a broken world or our sin, we must cry out to God. We must be persistent in crying out. I want you to get a picture of this. Arise and cry out in the night at the beginning of the night watches. He goes, their heart cried out to the Lord, verse 18. Let the tears stream down like a torrent day and night. Give yourselves no rest, no respite. Arise and cry out in the night. This idea of persistent calling out to God. It's day and it's night, and it's unrelenting. It's involving pouring out your heart, pouring out yourself. Watch verse 19 again. Pour out your heart like water before the presence of the Lord. Lift your hands to him for the lives of your children who faint for hunger at the head of every street. What a great principle for discipleship. Pour your hearts out to God in the midst of sorrow. Even if you look at your life and go, man, I have sinned, I have messed up big, and God is judging me. Well, what's Jeremiah's response? Pour out your heart like water to God. He will answer. He will listen. He longs for you to cry out to him. So do it. Call out every chance you get. Day and night, God hears. So as we get ready for chapter 3, and I am excited about chapter 3, these principles do come out, where we see that sin has a result. We are helpless in the face of our sin in terms of the result of it. But you know what? We have the one we can cry out to. We can cry out to God. So we must cry out to him. We must cry out to him persistently, and we must call out to him at all chances. Pour out our hearts like water. I want to leave you with that picture today. Let's wrap up in a prayer. Father, I thank you for the chance to read your word. I thank you for the chance to really, in some sense, stand in awe of your mighty power. And it invokes a sense of fear in me and in all who read this, as we see that you are not a fluffy puppy. You are a mighty roaring lion. You are a mighty, awe-inspiring God. And I pray we would worship you as that we would approach our sin like that we would see our sin as a deadly thing and an absolute abomination to a holy God. And when we are in suffering for our sin, or we are in suffering because it's in a broken world, Father, I thank you that we can cry out to you. For in you we only have hope. And I pray this in your name. Amen. Hello and welcome back to Lamentations chapter